Joan Carolyn Risch, born on May 12, 1930 in Brooklyn, New York, vanished from her Lincoln, Massachusetts home on October 24, 1961. At 31 years old, she was described as an intelligent, well-educated woman who stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighed 120 pounds, and had short, dark brown hair and blue eyes. Joan's early life was marked by profound tragedy that would later become significant to theories surrounding her disappearance. When she was just 8 years old in February 1939, her parents Harold and Josephine Bard died in what was described as a suspicious house fire at their Mountain Lakes, New Jersey home. Joan was visiting relatives in Brooklyn at the time of the fire, which local investigators ultimately deemed accidental despite the fire chief's initial suspicions. Following this traumatic event, Joan went to live with her maternal aunt and uncle, who formally adopted her and gave her the surname Natris. During her time in foster care before the adoption, Joan reportedly told an acquaintance that she had been abused by her foster father, though these claims were never officially confirmed. This troubled childhood would later fuel speculation about her mental state and potential motivations for disappearing. Despite her difficult early years, Joan excelled academically and graduated from Wilson College in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania in 1952 with a degree in English literature. She moved to New York City to pursue a career in publishing, starting as a secretary and eventually working her way up to editorial assistant positions at prestigious companies. Her publishing background would also prove significant to later theories about her disappearance. In 1956, Joan married Martin Risch, an executive she had met through her work in the publishing industry. Following their marriage, Joan left her career to become a full-time homemaker. The couple initially lived in Ridgefield, Connecticut, where they started their family with the birth of their daughter Lillian in 1957, followed by their son David in 1959. The families moved to Lincoln, Massachusetts in April 1961, just 7 months before Joan's disappearance. They settled into a home on Old Bedford Road in what was described as a peaceful suburban neighborhood where everyone knew each other. Joan quickly integrated into the community, becoming an active member of the League of Women Voters, while Martin pursued his career at the Fitchburg Paper Company. Friends and neighbors consistently described Joan as a happy and devoted mother and wife. She had expressed interest in becoming a teacher once her children were older, indicating future plans and contentment with her family life. There were no reported signs of marital discord or instability within the household, making her subsequent disappearance all the more mysterious. The day of the disappearance began like any other Tuesday in the household. Martin left early that morning at 6:50 a.m., driving to Logan Airport to catch an 8 a.m. flight to New York City for a business trip that would keep him away overnight. After her husband's departure, Joan woke her children and prepared breakfast as usual, maintaining her daily routine. At 9:30 a.m., she dropped 2-year-old David off at the home of Barbara Barker, her neighbor who lived directly across Old Bedford Road. She then took 4-year-old Lillian to a dentist appointment in Bedford. Following the appointment, Joan made a brief stop at a nearby department store, paying in cash for a few small items before returning home. The family returned to their home on Old Bedford Road around 11:15 a.m. During their absence, both the milkman and mail carrier had made their regular deliveries, and neither reported anything unusual about the residence when later questioned by police. Shortly after their return, a dry cleaner delivery driver arrived to collect several of Martin's suits, entering the house to retrieve them. He later testified that he noticed nothing out of the ordinary about Joan, the children, or the home's condition. Joan changed from the more formal clothing she had worn to the dentist appointment into a blue house dress and white sneakers. She prepared lunch for her children around noon and then put David down for his regular afternoon nap, which typically lasted until about 2 p.m. At 1 p.m., Barbara Barker brought her son Douglas over to play with Lillian in the Risch yard. During this time, Joan was observed doing light gardening work. The timeline becomes crucial in the final hours of Joan's confirmed presence. Shortly before 2 p.m., Joan took both children, Lillian and Douglas, across the street to the Barker house, telling Barbara that she would be back shortly. The children played on a swing set in the Barkers' backyard, from which they could not see the Risch house. At 2:15 p.m., Barbara Barker made what would be the last confirmed sighting of Joan Risch. Looking out her kitchen window, Barbara observed Joan moving quickly up her driveway, wearing what appeared to be a trench coat over her clothing and carrying something red in her outstretched arms. At the time, Barbara assumed Joan was chasing after one of the children or dealing with some urgent household matter. At 3:40 p.m., Barbara brought Lillian back to her home, intending to take her own children out on a shopping trip. Believing Joan was still inside the house, Barbara left Lillian at the front door without entering. When Barbara returned from her errands at approximately 4:15 p.m., she was confronted with a haunting scene. Lillian came running back to the Barker house, crying and saying, "Mommy is gone and the kitchen is covered in red paint." Barbara immediately rushed to the Risch home, where she found 2-year-old David crying in his upstairs crib, his diaper wet and unchanged, with Joan nowhere to be found. When she entered the kitchen, blood was smeared throughout the walls, floors, and other surfaces. This blood was found to be type O, which matched Joan's blood type. The wall-mounted telephone had been ripped from its mount and thrown into a wastebasket that had been moved from under the sink to the center of the kitchen floor. Tables and chairs were overturned, indicating a struggle or frantic activity. A trail of blood led from the kitchen through the house and out to the driveway, where it abruptly ended at Joan's parked car. The telephone directory was found open to the emergency numbers section, though no numbers had been written down. Despite extensive blood evidence, there were no bloody footprints anywhere in the house. However, there were signs that someone had attempted to clean up the blood using paper towels and David's coveralls. Most significantly, bloody fingerprints were found that did not match Joan's, indicating another person had been present. At 4:33 p.m., Barbara called the Lincoln Police Department. Within 5 minutes, Sergeant Mike McHugh arrived at the home. Lincoln Police Chief Leo Algeo was summoned around 5 p.m., followed by Massachusetts State Police Detective Lieutenant George Harnoy and eventually Middlesex District Attorney John Droney, who inspected the scene that evening. The investigation would involve extensive searches from 6 p.m. until the early morning hours of October 25th, with state and local police, as well as the Lincoln Fire Department, using bright lights to search the woods surrounding the home. Despite these immediate and intensive efforts, no trace of Joan was found. A police K-9 unit from the Massachusetts State Police's Andover Barracks was brought in, but the dog could only follow Joan's scent as far as the driveway where it ended. This supported the theory that Joan had either gotten into a vehicle or met some other fate at that location. Authorities immediately contacted hospitals, taxi companies, and nearby police departments to determine if Joan had sought help or transportation. They also checked mental health facilities and reviewed transportation records, but no leads materialized from these inquiries. From the crime scene, 3 bloody fingerprints were gathered but remained unidentified. Blood droplets were also discovered on the first step of the stairway, 2 more at the top of the stairs, 8 in the master bedroom, and 1 near a window in the children's bedroom. Several neighbors reported seeing Joan or suspicious activity on the day of her disappearance. Virginia Keene, the 14-year-old daughter of next-door neighbors, reported seeing an unfamiliar dirty 2-tone car, possibly blue and gray, in the Risch driveway around 3:20 p.m. The family's regular milkman stated he had seen a similar car in the driveway 5 days earlier during his morning delivery. Another neighbor saw a car backing out of either the Risch or Keene driveway around the same time. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Joan's description along nearby roads throughout the afternoon. At 2:45 p.m., a woman wearing clothing similar to Joan's was seen walking along Route 2A, wearing a handkerchief tied under her chin and appearing hunched over as if she were cold. Between 3:15 and 3:30 p.m., the most disturbing sighting involved a woman walking along the Route 128 median strip in Waltham, appearing disoriented with blood running down her legs and cradling something at her stomach. At 4:30 p.m., a final sighting near Trapelo Road described a woman matching Joan's description walking south. Remarkably, despite these apparent distress signals, no one stopped to help the woman in any of these reported sightings. Martin Risch was contacted in New York City around 11 p.m. on the night of Joan's disappearance. He immediately flew back to Boston and was extensively questioned by state and local police at the Massachusetts State Police Barracks in Concord until nearly 3 a.m. on October 25th, then brought back that afternoon for additional questioning. Martin maintained complete cooperation with authorities authorities and expressed genuine surprise and bewilderment at his wife's disappearance. His alibi was thoroughly verified with multiple witnesses confirming his whereabouts. Investigators found no evidence suggesting his involvement or prior knowledge of the events. In 1963, nearly 2 years after the disappearance, Sareen Gerson, a reporter with the local newspaper, The Fence Viewer, made a discovery that would change how the case was perceived. While researching background material for an article about the case at the Lincoln Public Library, she found that Joan had signed out one of the books she was examining, a volume about the purported disappearance of Brigham Young's 27th wife. Intrigued, she checked another book titled Into Thin Air by Harry Carmichael, which detailed a woman who disappeared, leaving behind blood smears and a towel. Again, she found Joan's signature on the checkout card. Gerson's discovery prompted a comprehensive review of Joan's library borrowing history by volunteers. Their investigation revealed a startling pattern. Over the summer of 1961, Joan had checked out 25 books, nearly all of which dealt with murders, missing persons cases, and mysterious disappearances. The collection included several particularly notable titles that would later fuel speculation about Joan's intentions. Into Thin Air told the story of a woman who plants her own bloodstains before disappearing. The Hunt for Richard Thorpe described a schoolboy who disappeared on purpose. Death of the Heart was a novel about an orphan who dropped from sight. When Gerson wrote to the author of Into Thin Air about Joan's borrowing of his books, he became fascinated with the case. He developed his own theory, stating that he believed Joan was still alive somewhere between Boston and New York, but was afraid to come forward because, quote, she harbors a terrible secret. He was reportedly working on incorporating his theory into a fictionalized account of the case. Aside from the theory that perhaps Joan staged her own disappearance, some have suggested that she may have had a medical emergency. This theory gained traction due to the specific nature and location of the blood evidence. Proponents suggest Joan may have attempted a self-administered abortion or suffered a miscarriage. This would explain the substantial blood loss in the kitchen area, the empty liquor bottle found in the trash, her disoriented behavior as witnessed by Barbara Barker, and the blood running down her legs as reported by highway witnesses. The era's limited access to safe, legal reproductive health care made such desperate measures more common. This theory aligns with the highway sightings of a woman in distress, suggesting Joan may have attempted to seek medical help but became lost or collapsed somewhere undiscovered. Another popular theory suggests Joan, in a disoriented state from injury or medical crisis, may have wandered into the nearby Route 128 construction site and fallen into a pit where she was accidentally buried during the road's completion. It would also provide a logical explanation for why no body was ever found. However, no excavation has ever been conducted to investigate this possibility. Some investigators maintain that Joan was the victim of a random violent crime. The bloody fingerprints that didn't match Joan's, the mysterious sedan seen in the driveway, the signs of struggle in the house, and the abrupt end of the blood trail at the driveway, suggesting she was taken away in a vehicle, all support this theory. Police investigated Robert Foster, a National Park Service agent who had been visiting homes in the area regarding a park project. Foster had visited the Risch home about a month before the disappearance, and some residents felt he had overstayed his welcome during his visits. However, he was eventually cleared after providing a solid alibi for the day in question. Another theory that Joan's husband, Martin, believes is that Joan suffered a psychological breakdown resulting in amnesia or a fugue state, leaving her unable to remember her identity or return home. He was steadfast in this opinion all the way to his death in 2009. However, Joan had no prior history of mental illness, nor was there any family history of such conditions. This entry takes place in Ostia near Rome in November 1975. Pier Paolo Pasolini was born in Bologna in 1922, during the rise of Italian fascism. This early exposure to political extremism would profoundly shape his worldview. By the 1960s and 1970s, Pasolini had established himself as one of Italy's most provocative figures. He was an openly homosexual, Marxist intellectual who consistently challenged the established order through his films, poetry, novels, and journalism. Pasolini's career involved the creation of several notable films and novels. However, it was his final film, Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, from 1975, that would become linked to his murder. Released just weeks after his death, this graphic adaptation of Marquis de Sade's novel used extreme imagery to critique fascism and consumer capitalism, establishing it as one of cinema's most controversial works. Writing for Corriere della Sera from 1973 until his death, Pasolini condemned Italy's entire political establishment, accusing the governing Christian Democratic Party of corruption and collusion with the mafia. Allegations that would later prove substantially accurate. His unfinished novel Petrolio explored similar themes, examining connections between fascist organizations, the mafia, the CIA, and even the Communist Party. On the morning of November 2nd, 1975, Pasolini's body was discovered on a wasteland near Ostia's Idroscalo by a passerby. He had suffered multiple broken bones, crushed testicles, and extensive burns, with evidence suggesting he had been beaten with metal objects before being run over repeatedly by his own Alfa Romeo. The autopsy suggested that multiple assailants were involved rather than a single perpetrator. The police response was notably lackluster from the beginning, as no security perimeter was established at the crime scene, allowing local residents to crowd around the body, which was hastily covered with a sheet. This failure to properly secure the scene would prove to be just one of many investigative shortcomings that would later fuel conspiracy theories about official negligence or deliberate obstruction. The same night, Giuseppe Pino Pelosi, a 17-year-old from Guidonia, was arrested while driving Pasolini's car at high speed without a license near Ostia. This arrest immediately made him the prime suspect in the director's murder. Pelosi quickly confessed to killing Pasolini, claiming self-defense after the director allegedly attempted to sexually assault him. According to his initial account, he had met Pasolini at Rome's Termini station, where they arranged to drive to Ostia for a sexual encounter in exchange for money. When Pasolini allegedly became violent and attempted rape, Pelosi claimed he fought back with a wooden board, then ran over the director with the car to escape. In 1976, Pelosi was convicted by a juvenile court and sentenced to 9 years in prison. However, the conviction acknowledged the involvement of unknown others, though this aspect was later retracted. From the outset, significant forensic evidence contradicted Pelosi's confession. Despite the brutal nature of the attack and the massive amount of blood at the scene, Pelosi showed no signs of a struggle. There was no blood on his clothing and no defensive wounds that would be expected from such a violent confrontation. The forensic evidence consistently suggested multiple attackers rather than a single teenager acting alone. Eventually, additional inconsistencies emerged from the crime scene investigation. 2 items of clothing found in Pasolini's car belonged to neither victim nor accused. Multiple footprints at the scene could not be attributed to either man, and a sweater discovered in the vehicle matched neither person involved in the official narrative. These unexplained elements suggested a more complex scenario than the straightforward sexual encounter gone wrong that authorities presented. The case underwent a dramatic transformation in 2005 when Pelosi, after nearly 3 decades, completely retracted his confession. In a television interview and autobiography, he revealed that his original testimony had been coerced through threats of violence against his family. He said, "I was terrorized. They have threatened my father and mother." According to Pelosi's new account, he had been present when at least 6 attackers arrived in 2 cars and a moped, beating Pasolini with metal bars while shouting "dirty communist" and other political names before running him over. He described 3 men with a southern accent as the actual killers, suggesting connections to organized crime networks. This retraction prompted authorities to briefly reopen the investigation, though it was quickly closed again despite the compelling new testimony. Sergio Citti, one of Pasolini's closest friends and collaborators, supported Pelosi's new version, claiming he had eyewitness sources who saw 5 men dumping Pasolini's body on the beach. Significantly, Sergio died in October 2005, the same day the reopened investigation was officially closed. Then in 2010, a breakthrough occurred when lawyer Stefano Maccioni successfully petitioned for modern DNA analysis of evidence from the crime scene. The results were startling and definitively contradicted the official narrative. Instead of finding DNA from only 2 people, Pasolini and Pelosi, forensic scientists identified genetic material from at least 5 distinct individuals. This forensic evidence represented the strongest proof yet that the official version of events was fundamentally flawed. Despite this compelling DNA evidence, the investigation was again closed in 2015, with a judge concluding that, quote, all the evidence led to the determination of Pasolini's murder as an assassination connected to a context of prostitution and committed solely by Pelosi. The DNA evidence contradicting this conclusion was inexplicably dismissed as irrelevant, raising serious questions about institutional willingness to pursue the truth. In December 2022, the Italian Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission released a report that introduced an interesting new motive for Pasolini's murder. Based on testimony from Maurizio Albertino, a former member of the notorious Banda della Magliana crime organization, the commission suggested that Pasolini's death was connected to the theft of film reels from Salo. The master copy of the film had been stolen from a Cinecittà studio shed on August 15, 1975, exactly 79 days before Pasolini's murder on November 2. According to Albertino's testimony, Pasolini went to Ostia not for a encounter, but to negotiate the return of his stolen film, with Pelosi serving as a mediator due to his connections with local criminals. This theory suggests that Pasolini was lured into a trap, where criminal gangs, possibly including neo-fascist groups, murdered him. The Parliamentary Commission identified particularly serious omissions in the original investigation, including the failure to interview witnesses who lived near the crime scene and overheard the attack. The report concluded that while justice might never be served for Pasolini's killers, establishing the truth remained important for the history books. The most drastic interpretations of Pasolini's murder center on his increasingly dangerous political journalism and his explosive unfinished novel, Petrolio. In the months before his death, Pasolini had systematically attacked Italy's governing establishment, making accusations of corruption, mafia collusion, and connections to neo-fascist terrorist bombings that would later prove accurate. The novel Petrolio, found incomplete in Pasolini's study after his murder, was intended to be a 2,000-page expose of connections between various power structures in Italian society. Significantly, one specific chapter titled Flashes of Light on ENI disappeared from his study during a reported break-in on November 5, 1975, just 3 days after his murder. This missing chapter allegedly contained explosive revelations about the 1962 assassination of Enrico Mattei, head of Italy's state oil company ENI. Enrico had challenged the international oil cartel and died in a suspicious plane crash. Pasolini's novel appeared to have reached the same conclusions about Enrico's murder that Magistrate Vincenzo Callia would confirm through official investigations in the 1990s. At the heart of Pasolini's research was Eugenio Cefis, the man who succeeded Enrico as head of the oil company when Enrico's plane exploded. In the novel, Eugenio was described as a man with a guilty smile, capable of anything, and the head of a private empire. Pasolini's notes explicitly stated that Eugenio and his clique required bombings that were attributed to the fascists to achieve their goals. Interestingly, Eugenio was revealed to be a founding member of Propaganda Due, aka P2, a secret Masonic lodge that operated as a shadow government in 1970s Italy. P2's stated goal was to stop the rise of the left, and many believed it had masterminded bomb massacres in Milan, Bologna, and Brescia. The organization included politicians, judges, military officers, intelligence operatives, and media figures, representing a true state within a state. This entry revolves around a failed balloon expedition that took place in 1897. It involved several Swedish explorers who attempted to reach the North Pole, but failed tragically. Salomon Andrée, a 42-year-old Swedish engineer at the Royal Patent Office in Stockholm, came up with what many considered a revolutionary approach to polar exploration. Unlike traditional expeditions that fought their way across treacherous ice on foot, Andrée proposed floating above the Arctic landscape in a hydrogen balloon, passing directly over the North Pole before landing in Russia, Canada, or Alaska. At the time, Sweden desired to compete with Norway's dominance in Arctic exploration, particularly following Fridtjof Nansen's achievements. Andrée's proposal gained tremendous support, including financial backing from Nobel Prize founder Alfred Nobel, who personally contributed about $1 million in today's value. Andrée's plan involved his invention of drag rope steering, a technique he claimed could deviate a balloon's course by up to 27 degrees from the wind direction. Through his previous flights with his balloon Svea, Andrée believed he had proven this method's effectiveness, though modern balloonists now consider this technique fundamentally flawed and dangerous. The Swedish Ballooning Association maintains that Andrée was simply mistaken, misled by inexperience and variable Arctic wind conditions. For the 1897 expedition, Andrée assembled a team of intellectuals rather than seasoned Arctic explorers. Knut Frankel, 27, was a civil engineer from northern Sweden. He was chosen specifically to handle meteorological observations after Niels Ekholm withdrew from the project due to safety concerns. Niels Strindberg, 25, was the other team member. He was a brilliant physics and chemistry student, tasked with aerial mapping and documentation. As mentioned, absent from this team were the survival skills and physical prowess typically required for Arctic exploration. As one source notes, all three men were indoor types. Andrée expected the voyage to go without any issue and thus wanted to focus manpower towards scientific capability rather than survivability. The hydrogen balloon, nicknamed Ornen or Eagle, was manufactured by Henri Lachambre in Paris, measuring 67 feet in diameter and constructed from varnished 3-layer silk. The balloon was designed to carry 3 men, equipment, cameras, and provisions for 4 months, totaling approximately 6,600 pounds. However, critical problems were evident from the beginning. During the 1896 attempt, Ekholm conducted buoyancy tests that revealed the balloon was losing 150 pounds of lift force daily through its approximately 8 million stitching holes. He calculated the balloon could remain airborne for only 17 days maximum, barely half of the required 30 days for the journey. When Andrée secretly ordered additional hydrogen top-ups to falsify buoyancy readings, Ekholm resigned from the expedition, warning that he wouldn't participate unless a better sealed balloon was procured. Despite these warnings, Andrée proceeded with the 1897 attempt using the same compromised balloon, now delivered directly to Svalbard without any testing. On July 11, 1897, with favorable southwest winds finally arriving, the expedition launched from Danes Island in Svalbard at 1:46 p.m. Almost immediately, disaster struck. The balloon's several hundred-meter-long drag ropes created excessive friction against the ground, pulling the basket into the water and causing the ropes to twist and detach from their screw holds. In the first few minutes, about 1,100 pounds of essential rope weight was lost, while the crew frantically jettisoned hundreds of pounds of sand ballast to clear the basket from the water. The total loss of 1,600 pounds transformed their supposedly steerable craft into, quote, an ordinary hydrogen balloon with a few ropes hanging from it at the mercy of the wind. The lightened balloon rose to an unplanned 2,300 feet, where lower air pressure accelerated hydrogen leakage through the stitching holes. Within hours, the balloon was dripping wet from rain, further weighing it down and forcing the crew to drop more equipment and sand to remain airborne. The Eagle's free flight lasted only 10 hours and 29 minutes, followed by another 41 hours of erratic low-altitude drifting with frequent ground contact before the inevitable crash. During this entire period, none of the 3 men slept. Communication with the outside world was limited to buoys and carrier pigeons. Only one pigeon was recovered, shot by a Norwegian steamer crew after it landed on their vessel. The bird carried a message dated July 13th stating, "Good journey eastwards, 10 DEG, south. All goes well on board." These optimistic words were a stark contrast to the desperate reality aboard the balloon. Andrée's diary revealed that they were constantly fighting to keep the balloon aloft, throwing overboard equipment and supplies while struggling with an increasingly uncontrollable craft. On July 14, 1897, after traveling for 2.5 days total, the Eagle made its final landing on pack ice near the 83rd parallel north. Remarkably, the crash was gentle enough that neither the men nor their equipment suffered damage, including Strindberg's delicate photographic instruments. Stranded on drifting pack ice approximately 480 kilometers from their launch site, the three men faced conditions for which they were completely unprepared. Their equipment, while extensive, proved poorly suited for Arctic survival. Their rigid sleds broke under the weight of supplies and proved impractical for navigating the complex ice terrain with its ridges, channels, and partially frozen melt ponds. Their clothing consisted of woolen coats and oilskins rather than the furs used by indigenous Arctic peoples. This choice left them constantly damp and cold in the humid Arctic summer conditions. Initially, each man dragged sleds weighing over 400 pounds, loaded with pemmican, canned foods, cheese, and other provisions. This proved unsustainable, forcing them to reduce their loads to 300 pounds per sled after abandoning much equipment. Food became increasingly scarce, making hunting essential for survival. The men spent a week at the crash site deciding their next move. They chose between two supply depots, one at Sjuajen in Svalbard and another at Cape Flora in Franz Josef Land. Misreading their maps, they incorrectly assumed both were equidistant and chose the more distant Cape Flora depot. On July 22nd, they began their march southeast toward Franz Josef Land, but soon discovered that ice drift was pushing them backward faster than they could advance. The terrain proved extraordinarily difficult, with ice ridges 2 stories high, requiring them to crawl on all fours. By August 4th, after extensive discussion, they changed course toward Sjuajani in the southwest, hoping the current would help them reach that depot in 6 to 7 weeks. Throughout their ordeal, the men hunted seals and even polar bears to supplement their dwindling supplies. Andrée's diary entries reveal moments of optimism, saying things like paradise, large even ice floes with pools of sweet drinking water, and here and there a tender-fleshed young polar bear. However, their diet of primarily half-cooked polar bear meat would later play a role in theories about their deaths. The men frequently suffered from foot pain, diarrhea, exhaustion, and were constantly cold and wet. Medical experts have suggested various causes for their eventual demise, including trichinosis from undercooked meat. Though this remains controversial since other Arctic explorers like Fridtjof Nansen survived on similar diets for extended periods. By September 12th, recognizing they would never reach their destination, the exhausted men resigned themselves to wintering on the ice. They made camp on a large ice floe, allowing themselves to drift wherever the currents took them. As they drifted rapidly southward toward Kvitoya, they hastily constructed a shelter with walls made of water-reinforced snow. Andrée recorded hopes that they might drift far enough south to sustain themselves entirely from marine resources. However, on October 2nd, 1897, disaster struck again. The ice floe began breaking apart directly beneath their shelter due to pressure against the shores, forcing them to evacuate their supplies onto the island itself, which was a process that took several days. Despite these setbacks, Andrée maintained optimism, writing, "Morale remains good. With such comrades, one should be able to manage under any circumstances." Strindberg's diary entries indicate they landed on the island on October 5th, with his final entries noting snowstorm reconnaissance on October 6th and what appeared to be the single word "moving" on October 7th. Andrée's final diary entry, dated October 8th, said, "It feels fine to be able to sleep here on fast land as a contrast with the drifting ice out upon the ocean where we constantly heard the cracking, grinding, and din. We shall have to gather driftwood and bones of whales and will have to do some moving around when the weather permits." Since both Strindberg's diary ended on October 7th and Andrée's on October 8th, it is inferred that all three men died shortly thereafter. Kvitoya, whose name literally translates to White Island in Norwegian, is the easternmost island in the Svalbard archipelago. This desolate, glacier-covered island was typically inaccessible to vessels of the era due to the wide belt of thick polar pack ice that normally surrounded it, and was often hidden by dense ice fogs. However, the island was known among sealers and whalers as prime hunting ground for walrus. The island's harsh conditions and remote location made it an unlikely place for rescue or discovery. Its terrain consists largely of rocky hills and glacier coverage, creating an environment where human remains and equipment could be preserved for decades in the Arctic climate. The Norwegian Brattvåg expedition of summer 1930, led by Dr. Gunnar Horn, officially aimed to study glaciers and hunt seals in the Svalbard region. However, the expedition carried a crucial secret mission: the annexation of Victoria Island for Norway. The expedition crew included both sealers and scientists. The weather was exceptional for Arctic conditions. Unusually warm temperatures had left the sea around the area virtually free of ice, making the typically inaccessible island approachable for the first time in memory. Some crew members decided to land on what they called the Inaccessible Island to hunt animals and conduct scientific exploration. While searching for fresh water, two sealers, Olav Salen and Karl Tusvik, made a major discovery. They found a metallic object protruding from the snow, which turned out to be part of a boat skeleton. It was frozen beneath a mound of snow and packed with equipment. Among the artifacts was a boat hook engraved with the words "Andrée's Polar Expedition 1896. This single piece of evidence immediately identified the site as the long-lost camp of the Swedish balloon expedition. Captain Peter Eliasson was summoned to the site, and he assigned the crew to search together with the expedition members. Their investigation revealed additional artifacts and the partial skeleton of a man half buried in snow and ice. The skeleton had been disturbed by bears, with much of the upper body missing, but a monogram on the jacket identified the remains as those of Andrée himself. Among their finds was a diary, though its pages were sealed together by glue that had dissolved and refrozen, making it initially unreadable. Near the boat, half buried on its side and filled with ice, they could see through the ice to clothing, equipment, a furled Swedish flag, and bones. Several yards from the camp, searchers found what appeared to be a grave with a skull lying loose on rocks. This burial site, disturbed by animals, yielded much of another skeleton. Based on initials found on clothing, this was identified as photographer Niels Strindberg. The crew took as much material as possible aboard their vessel, recognizing the historical importance of their find and the need to preserve artifacts that had survived decades in the Arctic. They were particularly concerned about leaving materials exposed to weather and animals, knowing it might be years before another expedition could reach the island. Captain Eliasson discovered the expedition's observation book, which he could partially open and believed had been written by Strindberg. The book's flyleaf was inscribed "The Sledge Journey 1897, indicating it documented events after they left the balloon. Before leaving the site, the crew created a memorial cairn on the hill where they had found Andrée's body. In the cairn, they placed a bottle containing a note. In this place, the Norwegian expedition to Franz Josef Land found the relics of the Swedish Andrée expedition. White Island, the 6th of August 1930. On August 8th, they met another sealer returning to Norway and arranged to send news of their discovery to authorities, while the Brattvåg crew continued their hunting and scientific work. On September 5th, in even better weather conditions with less ice, they found Frankel's body and additional artifacts, including a tin box containing Strindberg's photographic film, his logbook, and maps. The film was developed and provided documentation of the expedition's struggles. It showed the men dragging the heavy boat across the ice along with other various daily challenges. However, the exact cause of the three men's deaths has generated extensive debate among medical practitioners and historians. Several theories have been proposed, each supported by different evidence from their diaries and the discovery site. Trichinosis remains the most widely credited theory, proposed by medical practitioner Ernst Triedy in 1952. Larvae of Trichinella spiralis were found in polar bear carcass remains at the site, suggesting the men contracted this parasitic infection from undercooked meat. However, critics note that the main symptoms of trichinosis, particularly fever, are never mentioned in any of the men's diaries. Carbon monoxide poisoning is another possibility often mentioned by professionals, including explorer Vilhjalmur Stephenson, who argues they were using a malfunctioning stove. However, the Primus stove found at the site still contained kerosene and was likely positioned outside the tent. A polar bear attack is another theory advanced by author and physician Bea Uzma, who has spent nearly 20 years researching the expedition. After examining Strindberg's preserved clothing, she found what appeared to be rips from polar bears in his underpants, which he wore during burial. Based on how the bodies were positioned relative to each other, she theorizes that Strindberg was killed by a polar bear, and Frankel died shortly thereafter, possibly from injuries in the same attack. As for Andrée, she believes he may have taken his own life with morphine after he was left all alone. Supporting this theory is the discovery of Andrée's remains in a semi-upright position against a rock with his rifle at his side, a position unlikely to have been caused by polar bears. Additionally, nearly empty morphine bottles were found at the site, along with his diary neatly wrapped with a sweater, hay, and balloon cloth, suggesting he deliberately preserved it for future discovery. Other theories include vitamin A poisoning from polar bear liver, lead poisoning from canned food, scurvy, botulism, and simply succumbing to cold, dehydration, and exhaustion as the Arctic winter set in.